Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Scott Swanson, President, PNC Bank, Illinois. And on behalf of the Executives Club of Chicago Board of Directors, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you for today's program. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank all the seasoned sponsors who make programming at the Exec Club possible. As I sit here in my downtown office today, I'm excited to see larger crowds exiting the train stations, the L platforms, parking lots that are filling up more quickly, all encouraging signs as we realize, at least for the moment, a significant drop in COVID cases and a real yearning to get back to the office and be in person. Unfortunately, one of the issues we do continue to face is concerns over public safety. We are very fortunate that for our program today, we are joined by Jens Ludwig, Edwin A. and Betty L. Bergman Distinguished Service Professor, Director of the University of Chicago's Crime Lab, co-director of the Education Lab, and co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research, who will discuss his data-driven approach to understanding the city's challenges with crime and gun violence, as well as strategies to make a safer Chicago for residents, visitors, and the Chicago business community. Moderating today's conversation is NPR correspondent Cheryl Corley.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cheryl Corley, and thank you, Scott Swanson and the Executive Club of Chicago. Jens Ludwig, it is such a pleasure to be able to talk with you today about an issue that's really so crucial here in Chicago. We have so much. I'm going to have a chance also to ask a few questions, but I want to start off just by asking you about crime in general and how we view it, because most often our focus and our fears are about homicide and murder. And murder is really a small part of the equation when we talk about crime. Most of us hopefully aren't going to be murdered. So why is murder often considered the barometer for crime or how safe we are in a city?
Great. Thanks, Cheryl. And let me also start off by thanking you for being here. And thanks so much to the Exec Club for sponsoring this very important and timely conversation. I think what I would say for starters is the city of Chicago, like almost every American city, doesn't really have a crime problem so much as it has a gun violence problem. Mm-hmm. So if you look at Chicago overall, something like, less than 0.5% of all crimes that involve firearms. So that would be fatal shootings, non-fatal shootings, carjackings disproportionately involve guns, robbery with guns. So something like less than 0.5% of all crimes involve firearms, but they wind up accounting for something like 70 to 80% of the total social harm that crime overall imposes on the people who live in a city. And that's for two reasons. One reason is because, 80% of all crimes are property crimes. And almost everybody who lives in America will be the victim of a property crime at some point in their lives. And most property crimes are not life-altering events for the victims. That's very, very different for gun violence. So gun violence just shatters the lives of our communities. And the second reason that gun violence is so extremely damaging to cities like Chicago is because victims aren't the only victims. One of the things that you can see very clearly in the data is that gun violence is the thing that is most responsible for driving people out of cities. So my University of Chicago colleague, Steve Levitt, did an estimate several years ago suggesting that every murder that happens in a city reduces the city's population on net by about 70 people. And, if you look at the population loss from the city of Chicago, it's really been very disproportionately concentrated, unfortunately, in the predominantly African-American neighborhoods on the south and west sides where the gun violence is most concentrated. Mm-hmm. And we can see for everyone else in the city as well, that's the thing that is we live our lives. That's the thing that keeps us awake when our kids are out at night. That really is the key driver of the crime problem. And it's what makes the crime problem in general in America so different and so much more difficult than what you see in, other rich countries around the world.
Yeah, it's what we worry about.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we have seen this big hike in gun sales and you say gun carrying overall, yeah? And has that been since the pandemic started or what's going on?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think that we have a short-term problem here in Chicago, and then we have sort of a longer-term problem. And it's useful to be clear about both of those things. So in terms of the short-term problem, maybe the thing that I would say for starters is, the way that we're used to thinking about crime trends is year-over-year comparison. So we're in 2022, we'd compare it to 2021. That usually makes sense as a way to think about this problem, except in historically very aberrant circumstances, which I think we are currently in. So if you look at overall rates of crime, that's generally down over the last few years. But if you look at gun violence in particular, it's up dramatically since 2019. So we've had something like a 60% increase in murders and non-fatal shootings, something like between a 300% and a 500% increase in carjackings, depending on exactly how you count and when you start and end the comparison. And those changes are much larger than what you see in the country as a whole. And that's the short-term problem that we are still in the middle of. And things are going well here in Chicago than I think what you see in some other big cities around the country. Mm-hmm. And then I think if I can just sort of step back and look at the bigger picture question as well, which is even in 2019, you could see the long-term problem that Chicago was still struggling with. So if you rewind the clock back to, say, 1991, it seems almost hard to believe from the rearview mirror of 2022. But if you can remember back to 1991, the city of Chicago, the city of Los Angeles, and the city of New York had almost identical murder rates per capita at that time. Mm-hmm. Something in the neighborhood of 30 murders per 100,000 people living in the city. And since that time, the murder rate in New York City and Los Angeles, up through 2019, right before the pandemic, had declined by an amount that in 1991 could have imagined, something like 80 to 90%. And you could see over that 30-year period a huge divergence in rates of gun violence and murders between Chicago and these two other cities that predates the pandemic. In fact, if you look in the predominantly African-American neighborhoods in Chicago, the murder rate today is even higher than it was in 1991. And so I think a lot of these conversations we're having are around what is the damage the pandemic has done to the city and these short-term challenges that we clearly desperately need to address. But I think something has also gone not as we would like in a longer term sense that sits above any of the sort of the political debates currently of the moment that I think we need to really worry about as well.
Yeah, so what is that? This has happened over a 30-year time span. So what is different about Chicago versus New York or LA, where we've seen these big reductions in murders?
Yeah, I think that, when you start to look for explanations like that, it's very natural to start by looking at the things that we believe are among the most important drivers of gun violence. Okay. And so, when you look at what those things are, the key drivers of gun violence in American cities are things like poverty, things like the geographic concentration of poverty. So it's not just that cities have lots of low-income people, but that neighborhoods are very economically segregated, that neighborhoods are very racially segregated, and things like we know that those are all incredibly important determinants of gun violence. It turns out in this case that those are not the explanations, or they don't seem to be the explanations for this big divergence that we've seen between Chicago and New York and LA, in the sense that the poverty rate change over the last 30 years looks very similar in Chicago to what it's been in Los Angeles and New York City. If you look at our public school system, I mean, that's an incredibly important social system that I think we need to strengthen in Chicago if we want to dig our way out of the gun violence challenge. But our schooling outcomes don't look all that different from what you see in Los Angeles and New York City. I think most criminologists tell the story of the divergence as one of Los Angeles and New York City professionalizing their police departments and making them much more data much earlier and proceeding much more rapidly than what we've seen here in Chicago. And, I would just emphasize, even though that has been the path that LA and New York seem to have followed to transform their public safety environments, that need not be the right path for Chicago to get out of this problem. But I think at the very least, it's really important to recognize from the LA and the New York City experiences that there's hope, that the problem is not hopeless. Because I think, I've lived in Chicago for 15 years now, and I've listened to NPR every day. I've read the same newspapers. You see these problems persist year after year. Mm-hmm. And as a Chicagoan, it really is very easy to come to the conclusion that there's just not much that can be done about the problem.
Yeah.
And I think seeing that there have been some cities somehow, even if we decide not to follow their particular policy path, just knowing that we can dramatically transform what the city's like in terms of public safety, I think is just an incredibly important and fundamentally optimistic point to keep in mind.
I want to take you back to the whole issue of guns, because recently the police superintendent talked about illegal guns and the progress that he thinks that the city has made recovering guns with the help of a task force that includes state and federal officials. And when he talks about this and says, we've recovered more illegal guns this year than before, and the numbers just keep increasing. And, it makes me say, well, I'm not sure if we're winning in the fact that we're capturing a lot of guns. This is really a huge problem that it's hard to overcome. You're saying don't be hopeless, but how do you see that? That we have this huge proliferation, an increasing number of guns that that the superintendent says, well, we're capturing a lot of these guns, but we still have this huge problem.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that we clearly have a massive, so we have something like 330 million people in the United States. And, I think the best available data suggests that we have something like 400 million guns, right? And so we are a city in an ocean of firearms in a way that you just don't see in any other, almost any other rich country around the world. And that's a massive headwind for any American big city to try and overcome in terms of making itself safe. I think the gun problem, I mean, I think as most people on this call today will know, the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois have some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country. And And I think what's really important to keep in mind in thinking about the ability of gun regulations to make a difference one way or the other is, in many ways, firearms, it's almost like environmental regulation, where if you sort of think about regulating air quality, what happens in Gary, Indiana matters a lot for Chicago, and similarly, what happens in Chicago matters for Gary. And my family's favorite ice cream store, Dairy Bell in Hammond, Indiana. We drive there almost every weekend in the summer, and when we cross the state line, Indiana, and we come back, nobody's checking the trunk of our car to see what we're taking out of the city or what we're bringing back in. And that's just to say that it's cities and states to regulate their own way out of this problem in a world in which we have open city and state borders. And so I think there are reasons to believe that national regulation, the same way with sort of environmental regulation, that national regulation could potentially have a bigger impact. But I think we're all seeing the same sort of political environment here in the United States and realizing that changes in national gun laws are difficult. And so cities are going to have to think of other ways to solve this problem absent national changes in gun laws. And what Chicago is doing is something that I think most cities have been focused on, which is trying to prevent illegal gun carrying. I think if I were looking at what every American city is doing and thinking about what would be a useful sort of complement to that sort of activity, I think that we don't spend enough time trying markets that are responsible for getting the guns into Chicago in the first place, as distinct from focused on just getting the guns off the street once they're here, once they've been sold and they're in someone's waistband. And I think if you look at the data, one of the most important or one of the most surprising facts, at least it was surprising to me initially, is very, very few people who use a gun in crime bought that gun themselves from a licensed gun dealer, right? And so what that tells you, and almost nobody, I mean, maybe this will change in a world of 3D printers in the future, but at least up to now, almost nobody's making their own guns in their basement. And so what that tells you is that all of the guns being used on the streets of Chicago are moving through a series of underground market exchanges from the person who buys it to the gun store to somebody else who is bricks of Chicago. Now, you might think we've spent a lot of time and money trying to disrupt illegal drug markets, and that doesn't, by many accounts, it's not clear that that's done a lot of good. But I think there's an important difference between underground gun markets and underground drug markets, which is that guns are a durable good, unlike drugs, which are a consumable good. And so the number of transactions that you have every year in the underground gun market is like 1 or 2 or 3 orders of magnitude lower than what you see in the drug market. And there's a bunch of reasons behind that suggest that, like, law enforcement pressure on those markets could do much more good against guns compared to drugs. We have this big capacity in the Chicago Police Department that's worried about underground markets right now. They just spend a lot of attention on drugs instead. And so I think it makes you wonder how much safer we could potentially be if we sort of.
But yeah, aren't you talking though about a lot of regional cooperation that we would need? And Chicago, does have these gun laws and says, okay, we're going to go after this illegal market, but we're surrounded by states, and not just states, but municipalities where gun laws are really lax, and it'd be kind of easy for this secondary market to exist. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it turns out that when you look at the data on the largest source state of crime guns in Chicago, it's not Mississippi, it's not Illinois, it's not Indiana. Sorry, it's not Mississippi, Alabama, Indiana, it's Illinois.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, there are some things that we can do within state lines to try and, better monitor what's going on with the gun stores. I think the way to you sort of think about this, like the supply chain goes all the way from the gun store to the people who are mediating all of the transactions along the way, down to the sort of the retail sales at the street level in Chicago. And I think, the more that you can do upstream, the better. But even just doing more things to things like buy and bust or sell and bust operations in the underground gun market here on the streets of Chicago, I think would be a really important complement to what we've been doing historically.
Okay, all right. I want to talk about the pandemic and how much of a factor that has been in all of this. You mentioned it a little bit, but we've seen this skyrocketing increases in homicides, not just in Chicago. And I'm glad you pointed out that Chicago's crime level is lower than it has been in the past. I don't think people necessarily think about murder rates when we talk about homicides, but Chicago, not even in the top 10, is it, when we talk about murder? But I want to have you talk about the pandemic and the kinds of disruptions that we've seen with social services and unemployment and problems with schooling, some of the things that you touched on. But how much of that has really been a factor in what we're seeing here in the city, and how do we kind of alleviate some of that?
Yeah, maybe let me just touch very briefly, Cheryl, on something which is, I think when you think about the gun violence problem in Chicago, lots of people like to talk about tale of two cities on lots of different issues, but I think with respect to gun violence, it really is a tale of two cities or maybe three cities, right? So if you look at the downtown and the north side of Chicago, the rates of gun violence there are not so dissimilar to what you would see in New York or LA. And in contrast, if you look at the west side of Chicago or most of the south side of Chicago, you see rates of gun violence there that are not so different from what you would see in places like St. Louis, Detroit, or Baltimore. And so I think just the enormous disparities within the city itself, I think, is really important to keep in mind. Now, during the pandemic, I think the big sort of light bulb aha moment for me came when I found a survey that the Centers for Disease Control did last summer. So this was maybe 5 or 6 months into the pandemic, where they did a nationally representative survey of people, asking them about mental health problems that they'd experienced during the pandemic, related to depression, anxiety, increased substance abuse, trauma. And, among all American adults, something like 40% reported some sort of mental health challenge around dealing with the pandemic. But if you look at people 18 to 24, that was the youngest age group that they included in the survey, it was something like 70%. And if you look at the people 18 to 24 in this CDC mental health survey, said that they'd consider suicide in the last 30 days. I think a lot of us on this call, probably this hits close to home. We've had people in our families, young people in our families, really struggle with mental health during the pandemic, and we've seen this firsthand. The reason that that's important is because, when you look at the data on who's involved in gun violence, both as offenders and victims, it is very, very disproportionately people between the ages of, say, 15 to 35. And that's exactly the segment of the population that struggled the most in terms of their mental health around the pandemic. And, so I think of the gun violence as like one manifestation of these sorts of problems, but not the only one. When I drive down Lakeshore Drive from Hyde Park to downtown, it is like the Indy 500. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has noticed that. Fatalities are up something like 20%, even though miles driven per person has declined during the pandemic, right? We never used to read or see on the TV news stories about people punching stewards and stewardesses on planes.
Yeah.
When you look at data from the public school system, the amount of misbehavior or problem behavior by students has really surged as well. And so I think you're seeing different manifestations of the same sort of underlying phenomenon. That's sort of the short-term problem. And unfortunately, we really have this sort of terrible kind of 1-2 punch going on right now where like the pandemic has created the need for lots more sort of social supports for people.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the pandemic has made it incredibly complicated. Like everything in education and everything in the social services is basically one person helping another person. And before the pandemic interactions, and with the pandemic, that just massively disrupted all of these social institutions that had been there to try and help people. And then on top of it, the same sort of public health challenges disrupted the functioning of the criminal justice system as well, right? Starting with the police to the courts to the correctional systems as well. And so in many ways, it's been sort of like the perfect storm that, that cities across the country, including Chicago, having to deal with.
Yeah, that brings me to the whole issue of carjacking, and I want to get to that. But an audience member brought up a question that I think is important, and that you talked about early on about professionalizing the police and how that has worked in New York and in LA. Of course, in LA, they were doing it in many ways by consent decree, and Chicago is too. So talk a little bit about, what that would mean in the city here, and if the consent decree that Chicago is operating under is taking the steps that you think are necessary for us to get to that point.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's a question that is not unrelated to your previous question, Cheryl, which is a little bit like, the city is trying to do two. So, I know a lot of people from LA and a lot of people who helped implement the consent decree that the U.S. Department of Justice implemented with the Los Angeles Police Department. And everything that they tell me is that it was incredibly difficult. You can imagine, right? This is a giant organization with its culture. Changing the culture and the day-to-day operations of such a big organization is an time-consuming. It was resource intensive. It was politically difficult every sort of step of the way, logistically complicated. And LA, it was that difficult in LA, and they weren't trying to do it against the backdrop of a once-a-century public health crisis.
Yeah.
And so, I think it would be fair to say, like, the people who helped implement the LAPD consent decree would say, like, they never felt like it was going as quickly as they'd wanted. I'm sure that everybody involved in implementing the consent decree in Chicago would say the same thing, right? These things are just very difficult. And I think the open question that's just really hard to know right now is, once I was going to say if we get the pandemic in the rearview mirror, but let me be optimistic and say once we get the pandemic in the rearview mirror, I think the question we'll be able to learn some of the lessons from places like LA and implement this on a more rapid timetable. But if we can, right? Like here's the here's the reason why I think this is just so incredibly important. If you look at the national conversation right now, you would think that there are two things that are diametrically opposed. You would think that you can either have the police worry about public safety, or you can reform the police department to treat citizens with respect and fairly and have officers held accountable when they're engaging in misconduct and so on. And you would think that there's no way to do both, right? That's my reading of the national conversation. But when you look at Los Angeles, the murder rate, as I said before, dropped like something like 80% over the last 30 years. And Los Angeles, unlike Chicago, is one of those cities that conducts regular opinion surveys of the public and asks them what they think of the police department. And it has been plummeting. You can see that the fraction of people who say they have confidence in the LAPD and trust the LAPD doubled over that period.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
It shows you that you can do this. And I think, like, for the city of Chicago to thrive in the long term, I don't see what alternative we have but to do that, right? And I think, again, it's sort of a good news, optimistic story fundamentally that we've seen examples of cities be able to do this.
Yeah. So the whole issue about building trust and some of the steps, I guess, that the city has taken as far as trying to have police more involved in neighborhoods, community policing. Those are some of the steps that you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, I think one of the things that has been sort of very underappreciated in conversations about policing is that it's not just about, so when we talk about policing, we talk about resources. Should we spend more on the police or should we whatever? We talk about strategies. Should we do broken windows policing? Should we do community policing? When you look at the data, almost every police department in the country has the same playbook. They're all doing some version of focusing on high crime hotspots, focusing on the people who are at highest risk for engaging in gun violence, and community policing. Like, they all have the same playbook. And yet you can see enormous variability across cities in the effectiveness of their police departments, because I think the management systems that they have vary enormously in their ability to carry out that playbook effectively. And I think part of what the DOJ consent decrees are doing is trying to get the police departments to do a much better job implementing the decree, if that makes sense.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about carjacking in the city of Chicago, because I think that has alarmed a lot of people. Crime that's really so unnerving. More than 1,800 of those last year, maybe even more than that, most of any city as far as I know, and it's pretty scary. The police superintendent, David Brown, has held a press conference recently talking about how carjackings have actually gone down a bit in January and in February. And he's also talked about the number of arrests made by a regional task force. And so, is there a reason to be hopeful at this point, about people not being confronted, losing their cars, or is it really just too early to say?
Back to one of the points that I raised earlier in the context of gun violence more broadly, which is, I think, the usual approach we have of comparing this year to last year, I think in the case of carjacking kind of obscures more than it clarifies. In the sense that, if you look at like 2019 to today, the number of carjackings that we've had, year to date is up. 2022 relative to 2019 is up something like a factor of 4 or 5. So that's like a 400 or 500% increase from 2019. And so, when we look at the first few months of 2022 and we say we're down whatever 5 or 10% relative to 2021, it's a little bit like every part of our house is on fire, but the family room now it was before. Right? And I think this is just it is just an incredibly important challenge for the city to deal with, because as you say, it is so deeply unnerving. I think, I'd be very surprised if there's anybody in this meeting that doesn't firsthand know someone who's been affected by carjacking in the city of Chicago at this point. There's a sense that it happens, during daylight hours in parts of the city where, people haven't traditionally thought that, like at places and times where people have not thought that they'd be at high risk for being victimized by gun crime. And so you can understand why. Now, it turns out that it's still the case that carjacking is very disproportionately concentrated in the same economically disadvantaged. Other types of gun violence are concentrated, but I do think it's important. I'm not sure that I've seen myself in the data signs that the city has started to turn this around yet. But
Yeah.
we really need that to happen.
Yeah, Jens, what we've seen about these carjackings is so many stories about the involvement of juveniles and the increase with some kids as young as 11 being involved in this type of crime. But, that made me really think about how we phrase this, because it took me back to the 1990s as well when we talk about these stories. And at that time, there was a real popular term used about youth, them being super predators. And the data didn't support that at all. So I think we have to be careful when we talk about youth. And, what does the data say? And what does this tell us? Are more young people involved in this crime, or is it more about the publicity about, some audacious kind of action by a few? What are we seeing?
Yeah, so I think that I'd want to maybe distinguish between, I'd want to distinguish between sort of the framing and the rhetoric we put on a problem, and that's related to the kind of solutions that people sort of political preferences lead them to favor, and contrast that with like what we think the facts are in the data. And I think that the term super predators was coined in the 1990s to push a particular political agenda. But I think unfortunately, what's going on with carjackings today has also become a political football that I'm not sure really serves the city so well either, because I think we just have to understand, for starters, what the facts actually are, wherever they lead us, and then we can have an informed conversation about what we should do about it. So when you look at the data on who's arrested for carjackings, you can see that most of the increase in carjackings, at least according to the arrest data, seems to come from teenagers. So far and away, there's a big increase in involvement from teenagers, according to the arrest data. And
but isn't the arrest data pretty low, right?
Yeah, exactly. So then I think the natural thing to worry about there is, well, we're seeing such an incomplete picture of carjackings because the arrest rate for carjackings the last few years in Chicago has ranged from, call it 11 to 17%, how you measure it, right? And so how do we know what's going on with the large majority of carjackings that don't result in arrest? And so, we did a look at this for the Chicago Tribune in a piece that was published a little while ago. And one of the things that we did is we took advantage of the fact that the Chicago Police Department collects data from victims, where the victim tells the police what they think the offender's age was. Now, you might wonder how in the world how good are victims at this? And what you can see is one way we can get a sense for how good victims are at guessing the offender's age is in the 11 to 17% of cases where you have an arrest, you can compare the victim's report to the actual age that you have for the person who was arrested. And it looks like the victims aren't all that far off in their reports. And so, the ages of the people that victims are reporting as offenders, I think that confirms the picture that the teenagers are very disproportionately involved in the increase. And so then that brings you to this separate question of, if you believe that as the fact on the ground, then what do you do about it, which is sort of a separate matter altogether.
Yeah. Well, the mayor got a lot of flack talking about remote learning and students not being engaged as one of the reasons for a rise in carjacking. Does she have a point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a hard to deny aspect of this, which is, we've historically, for hundreds of years, we've had in-person schooling because we think in-person schooling is really developmentally productive for kids. Mm-hmm. And so it makes sense to think that when we close in-person schooling because of a once-a-century public health crisis, that it would have some consequence for kids, right? I don't see how you could deny that. Now, there's a political angle to this, which is like, if the schools would have opened a little bit sooner or a little bit later or whatever, like how much difference that would have made to carjacking. I don't think we have any way to answer that question. But I think, if we had the choice to have kept the schools open, if we could do it safely, I don't think anybody would have said, oh, it's a great idea to have kids sit in Zoom school instead of in person. We were forced into that by the pandemic, right?
Yeah. In the study that you did on that, there was a really kind of startling and tragic connection when it comes to carjackings and youth who are involved. You studied what happened to them 12 months later. So what did you find?
We saw with so these are the people these are the kids who the police arrested for carjacking, right? So these are the suspects in these carjacking events. When you look at them 12 months later, their murder victimization rates, the rate at which they are killed at the hands of another person, are off the charts relative to any sort of benchmark that you could imagine, including active duty US military troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think the reason that that's so tragic, Cheryl, we just talked about the role of schools and what they might be able to do to help protect kids in the first place from finding themselves in these circumstances, right? I think the other thing that we're not doing nearly as good a job of as we need to, and I think that statistic really highlights it, is, a very large share of the kids involved in carjacking not their first juvenile justice system contact. And I think that we need to be doing a much better job of thinking about those early juvenile justice system contacts as an opportunity to connect kids to the sort of intensive service, the kids involved, like a lot of the kids involved in carjacking really come from, extremely disadvantaged, high trauma environments. And they need really intensive social supports. And when you look at the data at their subsequent gun violence victimization, I think that tells you very clearly, like, we are not doing nearly as good a job even keeping them safe, connecting them to social services. And if we could do that productively, that would obviously not just help them, but help everybody in the city.
There are, as we're coming out of this pandemic, there are social agencies, I guess, that do deal with young people who are a little bit older who have been involved in the criminal justice system, right, and trying to keep them out of it. So you've done some work just looking at that. are they really effective? And, how do we as individuals help support that kind of activity?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I think in the 1970s, there was this seismic change in the country's thinking about the ability of social programs to prevent crime or facilitate rehabilitation. There was a very famous article in a journal called The Public Interest that concluded nothing works in the crime prevention rehabilitation space. And since then, I think we've learned a lot from behavioral science about how to do that. And one of the things that we've been doing at my research center, the University of Chicago Crime Lab, is we've been working to test promising sort of social programs, in a way that's as analogous as possible to how the FDA requires drug companies to test new medications through, something akin to the policy analog of a randomized controlled trial in medicine. And we're seeing really, really encouraging and really rigorous and, to me, convincing evidence that we have learned a lot about how we can keep kids away from crime involvement, both as victims and offenders, to make their lives better and improve public safety at the same time. I think the big challenge that we're facing sort of two challenges in doing that, and one is thinking about how you scale successful programs. And so I think this is an area where sort of the public sector and the NGO sector would really benefit from learning from the private sector how you successfully scale. I think that would be one thing. That sort of technical transfer and in-kind assistance to local NGOs would be absolutely invaluable. And then I think the other bottleneck is resources. And when you look at the data on the Chicago public schools, I think most school finance experts think that the Chicago public schools are underfunded by something like a third. And so I think of the public schools as our frontline defense in social policy, right? When you think about social policies to make people's lives better, you have to start with the public schools. If we're underfunding that, it surely can't be a surprise that we are not funding other sorts of social programs, including ones that are demonstrated to be helpful in preventing crime, and anything near the scale that we need to really move the needle on public safety in Chicago.
Okay, all right. I want to talk. We only have a few minutes left, but I want a button issue that's been surrounding any discussion about crime, particularly not just here in Chicago, but across the country, is the whole issue of bail reform. And what exactly that means as far as people being out on the street and crimes being recommitted. So the question is not only about bail reform, but about electronic monitoring and what that all means. Of course, the state legislature passed a law, which means we're going to be done with bail by January of next year, and judges will really have to decide whether to hold a person in jail or not. But the belief by critics, of course, is that that the changes surrounding bail and the use of electronic monitoring is really part of what is driving rising crime and increasing recidivism. So, does the data kind of support?
This is something that I've been trying to figure out from the. Something that I've been trying to figure out, and I'm still trying to really fully understand what's going on. But my current get, let me say this as a get. So it's harder to figure out than one would like, because it's been harder to get all the data that one would need to figure this out. And so I think that itself doesn't seem great, right? I can figure out what's going on with my Domino's pizza down to the second. And yet I can't quite figure out what's going on with the number of people released pre-trial or on EM and so on and so on. There's some very weird mismatch there that I think is not helpful for the goal of for an informed public and democratic accountability. So that's one sort of thing. But My guess is that that the numbers don't like. It could be form and the growing use of EM might wind up contributing a little bit to the rise in gun violence, but I would be very, very surprised if the final data implicate that as the key driver of what's going on in gun violence in the city, right? But that doesn't mean to say that, like, I think that there aren't things that we could productively do in thinking about pretrial, even in the context of like these reforms that are being implemented. Because I think like one of the things that we've seen in the data, looking at data from around the country, is most court systems don't do a great job in practice prioritizing pretrial detention for the people who are really high risk. And so they wind up jailing a lot of low risk people and releasing a lot of high risk people. And so I think like just that provides sort of a win-win. You can reduce the jail population and reduce crime just by doing a better job of making sure it gets you out of the left-right fight over bail reform.
Yeah, and I guess the few studies that have been done, I mean, in New Jersey, Washington, D.C., they say that they haven't seen any kind of increases. But I guess this is a fight that that will continue.
Yeah, and we've been doing a bunch of work with the state of New Jersey courts, and it seems like one of the things that they did as part of their reforms is to effectively prioritize detention for the people who are really high risk. And I think that's been one of the helpful ingredients for why you've seen incarceration decline there and crime decline at the same time.
Yeah. We only have, a couple minutes left, Yin, but I want you to talk to the folks who have joined us. And you talked a little bit before about, what people could do. But I think a lot of folks feel maybe frustrated the city because of crime. So what would you suggest that people in our audience, what kind of steps could they take to help?
Yeah, I think that, I already mentioned, more technical transfer of how to sort of scale from private sector to NGOs and public sector would be super helpful. I think pushing for more data availability and transparency. I think because the county and the city run different parts of the criminal justice system, we have an unfortunate tendency in the 15 years that I've been here to do a lot of finger pointing, and without good data, it's hard to know who to hold accountable. And I do think that, historically, Illinois has not been a state that has done a great job transferring resources to big cities like Chicago that need help, that are serving large economically disadvantaged populations and need financial assistance from the rest. This is an audience that includes a lot of very influential people who have the opportunity to help push the state to do more, starting with just the funding situation for the Chicago public schools, but hopefully not ending there.
Yeah. Well, this is a discussion that we could have for many hours. We only have an hour. So I'm going to wrap us up. It's been really a challenging year and a few years in Chicago, not only in Chicago, but throughout the country, a pandemic. And as we all know, these really sharp increases in homicides. Jens Ludwig, your data and the work of the University of Chicago Crime Lab really helps illuminate the problems as well as what the possible solutions could be. So I thank you for your work. I think we're all kind of indebted to you and the work you do, and also to our discussion today. And thanks to the Executive Club of Chicago and to all of you who have joined us